So now we are into a new chapter. Actually, this is a last chapter regarding to the measurement, right? So remember, we are in the module to understand how we measure in the macroeconomy. The first chapter we learn, so we learn how to measure in GDP. Okay, and actually in that chapter, we also learn how to measure in the price level, right? Now, the second chapter we learn is we understand economic growth. Okay, so now we're in the last chapter. So in this module, so we are going to look at business cycle, and particularly we are going to look at unemployment and inflation. Okay, so the reason why we bring them together is because first, if we look at data, so these two have some interesting correlation. And secondly, as we are going to learn toward the end of this semester, so the central bank has explored this correlation between unemployment and inflation so that they can take the proper or appropriate monetary policy whenever the economy is in recession or when the economy is overheat, right? And this is a roadmap of this chapter. So essentially everything is going to centering around between unemployment and inflation, right? So in terms of unemployment, so we need to understand how we measure unemployment. And we also need to understand some salient features about our labor market, different type of unemployment. And in terms of inflation, so we need to understand the cause of inflation, why we care about inflation, right? Okay, so that's the roadmap. Now to start with, these slides kind of emphasize the importance of this chapter, right? So the current chairman of the Fed is Jay Powell. He was nominated by, it was nominated by Barack Obama, but then so was confirmed by President Trump, right? So as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, so essentially, he's what? He's the central figure of the central bank, right? And his main job is going to balance the need of workers against the need for price stability. So now what is need for worker? So that goes to the first main topic of this chapter. What we can intuitively think about. So what's the need for worker? The worker need a job. The worker need a stable income, right? So in that sense, so the central bank, so they should make sure, so the labor market is healthy. But then, so in this chapter, we are going to learn what we mean labor market is healthy. And on the other hand, so the chairman need to strike a balance between need for worker, as I just explained to you, and against the need for price stability. But what is, excuse me, what is price stability? So essentially we need low inflation, right? But then, so why these two things can happen, or so why they must strike balance? So this usually, so these two is going to affect each other. So if the price is too high, it's going to affect unemployment. Unemployment is going to lead to the lower price either way. So these two are going to correlate, as we are going to see later, right? But that also explains, so in the current state, that explains so why we want to understand the measurement of these two things in the same chapter, because these two are intertwined. They are going to correlate each other. And the central bank has taken these two as the main policy goal, right? Okay, so now let's look at some historical data. So this is the unemployment rate for the United States since 1948, as I explained to you earlier. So essentially that's just after World War II, right? So the economy is entering like a very stable and mature period. Okay. Now from this unemployment data, oh, by the way, so we are going to learn what's unemployment immediately after these slides. Okay. But first, just take a look on this data and see what we can observe or what statement we can make. Okay. What are the stylized facts we can learn from observing this data, right? So there are a couple of things. Since number one, the unemployment rate is significantly different from zero. And even more than that. So the unemployment rate for the most of the time, it never dropped below 4% for most of the time. Right? It is significantly more than higher than zero. So this is number one. Okay. And then number two, so this unemployment rate fluctuates. Okay, sometimes high, sometimes is low. Okay, it fluctuates. Now three, so the fluctuation of the unemployment rate correlate with the inflation or correlate with business cycle. So just remind you, so what is business cycle? Okay, so we have learned in previous chapter, right? So what's business cycle? Essentially, it's up down of the economy. So in recession, usually means economy is in a contraction. Those are just highlighted by this shaded area. And then, so what we found is, so usually when the economy is in contraction, like look at those 11 episodes of recession, or let's look at the most recent one, financial crisis. So you can see, so the unemployment usually went up, right? And then, so once the economy is in expansion or recovery, the unemployment start to decline. Right? So those are three observations we have, right? But certainly, eventually, we want to make sense of those observed phenomena. But the first thing first, we need to understand how we measure unemployment. Okay, so there are some definitions. Okay, so instead of explain to you the definition right away, so I would prefer just give you a, let me use the blank slides. Sorry. Okay, so I need to explain to you what is the labor market, okay, or how the labor market is characterized, right? So our starting point is the total population. Okay? Let's start total population. Okay. So in the US, the current total population is close to 300 million. So that's where we start. But in terms of the labor market, okay, so we are going to exclude some of the population from this total market. Okay? And we are going to focus on adults, non-civilian, and non-institutionalized population. Okay, so what that means, so we are going to exclude everyone is 16 and younger, it's number one. And secondly, we are going to exclude everyone who is institutionalized. Okay, so who is considered as institutionalized? Two examples. Some who need care, like who in a nursing home. Another example, someone who served in the prison. Okay, so those are institutionalized. So we exclude them from our discussion. Now, the third category we usually don't consider is non-civilian. Okay? I guess, say, for example, the military personnel. All right, so we start from total population and then go to this, actually we call adult population, short for adult population. But remember, so this is more than, so the restriction is more than just simply adults. We look at adults, not institutionalized. They are civilian. And then, so we end up with close to 200 million. Okay, so this adult population. So this is where we start to look at the labor market. Right, so the adults. All right, so then, so among these 200 million, this rough number. So now we are going to categorize them into two groups. One, they are in labor force. And then, so we have a fraction of them, they are not in labor force. And then so you may be wondering, okay, so who is considered as in labor force? So the labor force includes those people who are employed and those are unemployed. All right, and it's probably better use a pie chart. So this is our adult population. But remember, so adult population is coming from this total population, right? So just like subset of total population. But then among adults of population, okay? So now we are going to categorize them into two groups. So these not in labor force. And then the rest, they are in labor force. But for people who are in labor force, some are employed, some are unemployed. Now, the last questions. So how we define someone is employed, and we define someone is unemployed. Okay, so whoever has a job, whether it's a full-time, part-time, whether you like a job or you don't, you are employed. But now, who is considered as unemployed? So there's a technical definition. You don't have a job, number one. You are searching for a job, number two. Okay, and more specifically, you have searched for a job during the past 4 weeks. Okay, then you're unemployed. All right. So if you haven't searched for a job during the past 4 weeks, and then you're not unemployed. If you don't have a job, you're not employed. So that just means if a person, so you haven't searched for a job for the past 4 weeks, but you are in this adults population, then so you are considered as not in labor force. All right. So now let's look at the definition, and then so we are going to understand them via examples. Okay. But this is just a rough idea. So how we are going to characterize the labor market. But remember, so the labor market, where we start, the total population. So labor market is just a subset of total population. Right. So we are going to exclude young, someone too young. And then we are going to exclude someone who's institutionalized. Right? But remember here, so regardless how old are you, so as long as you are older enough, even you're 80 or 90, so you're still considered as adult population as long as you're not in the nursing home, right? So you may consider as not in labor force if you retire, but it could be the case, okay, so even you're retired, you are looking for a job again, right? So now let's look at the definition. Unemployment rate. I guess it's better to start with labor force. Labor force includes all workers, employed or unemployed. Okay. But now, so what is unemployment rate? Unemployment rate essentially, we just look at the labor force, the fraction of people who are unemployed. So remember, so let's just write it again. So this is adults population. Right, so we have labor force. So this is employed, is unemployed. So this is not in labor force. So what is unemployment rate? Well, unemployment rate is just this part as a fraction of this part. All right, so the denominator is going to be this part. All right, it's not like, okay, so we divide by the total population. It's not we divide by the adult population. So we just divide by the labor force. Okay, so this is unemployment rate. Now, labor force participation rate. So this is the percentage of adults in labor force. So essentially, okay, so this big pie is the adult population. We are asking how many people inside here, employed or unemployed. Right, so those are the definition. Right? So now we can look at this definition in the formula, right? So labor force participation rate. Right? So essentially it's a fraction of adults population who are in labor force. Okay? But who is considering labor force? Unemployed or employed, right? So that's give you the labor force. And here, so the labor force participation here actually gives you the definition of labor force, or sorry, the adult population. Adult population, look, is 16 and plus, non-institutionalized, and civilian population. All right, again, so who is considered as non-institutionalized, or not in the assisted living home, or not in prison, or other institutions, right? Civilian usually means you're not a military, right? So that's just separate. That's just separate categories. Okay. All right, and then similarly, we can look at unemployment rate via this formula. The key thing here is denominator is labor force. Numerator is obvious, unemployed. But we divide by the labor force. Okay, I want to emphasize you are not divided by adult population, not divided by the total population. You divide by the labor force. So that is our denominator. Okay, so those are the definitions. All right, so now we can look at these practice questions. So we have a sense how we do the calculation. Okay, read these, and I'm going to explain to you how we calculate the number. All right, so the key message we have, the size of the labor force is 24, right? So we have 24 as in labor force. Now, among this 24 million, 21.5 employed. The question asks you, what is the unemployment rate? So we need to find out the number of unemployed. But the number of unemployed equal to labor force minus number of employed. Hence, so in the numerator, we have 24 minus 21.5. Okay, so if you like to multiply by 100, so that gives you the normalization. Okay, and then you can do the algebra, very straightforward. So the answer is going to be A, 10.4. Right? So these practice questions. Now, unemployment rate, so usually has been closely watched by newspapers, by Wall Street, by investors. Like in the US, almost every week, they report, usually like Friday morning, they report the job growth. And every week, every month, they report the unemployment rate, right? So, but is unemployment rate a perfect indicator? The answer usually is not, right? It is good, but it can provide some misleading information. So there are two possible bias if we only look at unemployment rate. Number one, it could overstate the true level of unemployment. Why is that? It's because even in a very healthy labor market, it takes time for people to sort out the right job. Just think about a college graduate, right? So you need time to sort out, okay, so which sector I like, where I want to live, right? And so once you find a job, and it takes you time to relocate, right? And but then so usually temporarily, so you are characterized as unemployed because you're not a full-time student. You haven't started a new job, but you are searching for a job, you're unemployed. But so your unemployment is a bad thing or a good thing? It's not a bad thing, right? It takes time for you to find the right job. Okay, so in that sense, so the unemployment rate itself can overstate the problem. Okay, so this is even in a very healthy labor market. The other way to understand this, just think about in the marriage market. Okay. So do you know someone so you like or you love somewhere, but you should take time to find out where's the other person, right? So this is a similar idea, right? Now, on the other hand, the unemployment rate can understate the true level of unemployment. Why is that? It's because just imagine if the recession is so deep. So there's a person who couldn't find a job and they got really burned out. And then so he or she may decide, so I probably it's better to stay at home, playing some video games, okay? And then so collect some unemployment benefit. Or if there's not, and then so I can do some leisure things, just live with my saving. All right? So in that sense, so but then, so that person is not unemployed because he or she has given up looking for a job, and then technically is not considered as unemployed. So in that sense, it will understate the true level of unemployment, right? Okay. But as a matter of fact, so the unemployment statistics doesn't consider the following three particular categories. Okay? Or in other words, so these three particular categories, so their existence also indicates unemployment rate is not a perfect indicator. It understates the underlying problem in the labor market. Okay, now let's see who they are. So first, you have discouraged worker. So those are who don't have a job, has tried to search, but eventually they give up. So they find that this is hopeless. This is really exhausting. And now it's rather to stay at home, doing some leisure things. Right? So this discouraged worker. Now, the second type is called marginally attached worker. They are slightly better than discouraged. So they haven't given up their hope. They hang on there. Okay? But they are almost in the point of no return. They have not searched for a job during the past months. But that's the threshold so that this person can consider as unemployed, right? But however, they have searched in the past 12 months. So that's different from the discouraged worker. Finally, so we have some underemployed worker. So those are the person who work part-time, but actually they prefer to work for full-time for some reason. So they couldn't find a full-time job. For the US, one of the main reasons so people couldn't find a full-time job, or one of the reason the employer offer you part-time job is to avoid the cost of health insurance, right? Because usually, so in order to offer you a full-time job, the firm is required to provide health benefit. And then for the firm, if the profit margin is low, or if they want to save the cost, so they may just offer you part-time job so that they don't need to offer you health benefit, right? But certainly that just creates a problem to the worker because healthcare is very expensive. Okay? So those are the three types of particular workers. So their existence indicate the unemployment statistics is not a sufficient number to look at, right? So first, let me show you the actual data, and then I'll further explain to you. So what's the problem with looking at unemployment only, and how we can compensate the problem by looking at alternative or looking at additional numbers, right? So look at this time series. So this is the unemployment number for US from 1994 to 2014. On the very bottom, so this one, the red one, so this unemployment rate. Okay. But now if we consider or factor in those discouraged workers, you can see this number start to go up. And interestingly, you can see that this gap, so this gap between these two, enlarge during deep recession, right? So this is financial crisis. So we know the crisis or the recession was very deep, right? So there are more and more people lose their patience or just give up, lose their hope, right? Now, next, we add marginally attached worker. So you can see there are things getting further worse. Finally, if we consider involuntary part-time worker, so you can see the huge gap, right? So before I explain to you these practice questions, now let's just think about the following scenario. So if we have a unemployment rate of 5% for the current economy, all right? Now, let's say, for example, the recession is coming, okay? And so make things easier. Okay, let's just promise you with this pie chart. Okay? So this is unemployed, this is employed. All right, and currently the unemployment rate is 5%. Now, say for example, so the recession comes so quick and so bad. A fraction of those unemployed people, so they decide, okay, so this is hopeless for me to find a job. I'm not going to looking for a job. Now, if we look at unemployment rate, then immediately what do we see? So immediately, so you're going to see the unemployment rates drop. Why? Because the number of unemployed will drop. Because you lose a fraction. So these people becomes not in labor force. All right? So in that sense, the unemployment rate can be a misleading indicator. So the drop in unemployment rate largely coming from, there are people who get so desperate due to the deep recession, so they give out the search. Or in other words, in this case, unemployment is going to drop. But we can compensate the imperfection of unemployment rate, or we can try to paint a more comprehensive picture by looking at labor force participation, right? Why? Because now if we look at labor force participation, you're going to see labor force participation rate. So this is going to drop. Why? Because the side of here is going to decline, right? Or in other words, if we see the unemployment rate drop and the labor force participation rate drop at the same time, we should realize, so we are in a deep trouble instead of, so because if you only look at unemployment rate, it sounds like, okay, so we are doing well. But as a matter of fact, if we find out labor force participation rate is also declining, then it means their people becomes desperate, lose their confidence, right? So that's how we compensate the imperfection of unemployment. Now let's look at these questions and then find out how we solve for unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate. All right. So this table gives us information on adults population, labor force, employed, discouraged. Right. So the first thing I would do is just find out the number of unemployed. So that should be 150 minus 138.75. Right. So this labor force, this is employed. So the first thing I would like to do. Okay. So it asks, what is unemployment rate? So we use this number divided by labor force. Next, what is labor force participation rate? So we are going to use this number divided by this number. Okay, we use labor force divided by adults population. Okay, and then answer is D. Right? So that's very straightforward. Next practice questions. Read this question carefully and think about who can be counted as unemployed. A, certainly not, right? So Darren is even not in adults population, right? Because adults population is 16 and plus. B, Nazma, no, it's not in labor force, right? So she hasn't looked searching for a job. C, Moisha, full-time college students, no, not in labor force, right? So full-time students, right? So students is this individual's full-time sense, right? D, Carl, who works part-time but would prefer more hours. No, unfortunately, is employed. Okay, but remember, so he's underemployed, right? So the answer is E. Okay, so D is very tricky. Okay, so Carl has a job, even though so he wants more hours. He's called underemployed. Right. All right. So here they just summarize what we just discussed. Unemployment rate is useful, important, but it's not perfect. Okay. It doesn't tell us the quality of job. It doesn't tell us how well people match their job. Right? And then, so in order to compensate this imperfection, what we can do? So we are going to look at other indicators. So this indicator includes labor force participation. So I already gave an example. So if the recession leads many people lose their confidence, leave the labor force, and then so you're going to see the unemployment rate hang around there, doesn't increase much or even decline. But at the same time, labor force participation rate will decline. So if we bring them together and then so we realize, oh, so the relatively stable or even declining unemployment rate is not because we are doing well. Instead, it's because people get so desperate, so they don't want to hang on there anymore, right? So this first one. Second, number of full-time job. So that's going to give us a measure how many people are underemployed. And then lastly, average wage. So that just tell you the quality of job, right? So if the average wage is low, that just means so the quality of job is low. On the other hand, so that just means the market is fairly healthy. All right. Okay, so we can look at some data. Okay? And this data just show us other dimensions. Okay? Other dimension that the average number cannot tell us. So we look at 3 different data points, 2007, 2010, and 2014. Okay? And so 2010, that's the trough of the Great Recession or the financial crisis, or that's the worst day, right? And in 2014, we started in recovery. So that represented by this overall number. The unemployment rate so increase and a decline. Correct? So because we enter the recession in 2007. And then so we reach the trough, and then so we start to recover. So that's overall. Now this overall picture doesn't tell us what happens for different ethnicity or different race. And then further by age and by gender. Now let's look at some decomposition. Look at some spatial group. First, look at African American. The overall trend is the same, but the magnitude is much higher. So that just tells us some inequality exists in the labor market. Now, if we look at younger people, we start white teenagers. So this number is significantly higher than the overall. You may be wondering why we care about teenagers unemployment rate. So this is because so the teenagers' employment experience play an important role for them to develop some social skill and other skill. So that is going to extend well into their future career. So that's why we watch the teenagers' unemployment rate, right? So certainly this is higher, but now, so really troubling is the African American teenager. So their unemployment rate is significantly higher than white teenagers, higher than overall, higher than everyone. So besides this is a teenager, so their lack of employment opportunity will hurt them to develop their social skills. Now this is like a particular social class or particular ethnicity. So their parents is suffering more than the overall. So that just means so the parents may not have the resource, the time to educate them. So not at the same time, so they don't have a job, there's like a double whammy, right? So that's going to create potential crime, potential social problem, right? So again, so this just tells us, so the unemployment rate is very important, but we need to look at this through different angle, okay? And we all need to understand what is behind those numbers. Right. So if we look at long-term data, we are going to observe an interesting correlation. What is the correlation? The real GDP growth, unemployment rate, or this change actually means, okay, so if you have higher, means you're doing worse. If you have a lower, means you're doing better. Okay? So again, see if we look at long term, so there's a nice curve can fit this data, right? And so that just means, so when the economy is doing well, and usually the labor market is also doing well, right? So we will have a slide to explain what is behind this trend. Okay. But for now, let me show you the other data so that we can move to the next topic. Okay. So what do we see here? So we are going to comparing the unemployment rate for everyone is older than 25. Okay, so this is like a prime age, right? And then, so we also look at a small group, a subset of these adults who are recent college graduates. So that refers to you in a couple of years. And then what we find is that the recent college grads, they are facing a much more challenging problem, right? And so usually their unemployment rate is higher. But yes, part is because the friction. It was a friction, like I told earlier. So for the college grads, you need to take time to find out what job you like, where you want to live, right? Where you want to start your career, and you need to relocate. So that's part of the story. But on the other hand, so the problem is during the recession, so people may not want to hire someone who lacks the experience. But what that means to the college graduates, so that just means in the recession, so you will have hard time to jumpstart. But certainly that's a bad thing to the economy, right? Okay, so now let me just move on, go to the other aspect of labor market, right? So what we talk about is, so we should look at labor market by looking at employed, unemployed, right? We even look at labor force participation and many other aspects. So now here we are going to characterize the unemployment into different types. Okay, so that's give us a deeper understanding to the labor market. Right. So by looking at historical data, so we find out, so the unemployment rate never dropped below a positive number. So this is significantly above zero, right? Remember, in our microeconomics, so we have supply and demand. So if the market works perfect, and then so the unemployment ratio equal to zero, right? So if supply equal to demand. But in reality, this number is significantly above zero throughout history. We need to find the answer to that. Then the answer lies into different types of unemployment exists, right? So there are three types. So first type is called frictional. And second is called structural. And then so we have cyclical. Okay. Give you a big picture and then so go into details. The big picture is, so these two, the first two, this is called natural. It is natural in the sense it's caused by the fundamental issues exist in any economy. And then the difference between natural and then the actual, the difference, that gives you the cyclical. And what causes the cyclical? And then largely goes to here, goes to here, right? So depending on economic growth, right? But then, so we have one slide to explain. So why the cyclical exists and why cyclical unemployment correlated with business cycle. This is a big picture, right? Now let's see, so what do they mean? But before I show you what each type of unemployment means, let's look at how the typical labor market work, right? Okay, so the starting point is, so we have the circle represent adults population. And then so we categorize three groups. This is employed, this is unemployed, this is not in labor force, right? So that's for any adults population. So you are possibly stay in one of these three parts. Okay, so you can just think about, okay, so maybe we can say, okay, there are three islands. So island E, island N, island U, there are three islands. And then at any point of time, so you can potentially live on one of those three islands. So that's the way to think about. Okay. Now, if you live in island E, so here, you could move to N. You can also move to U. Right? So if you move to N, so that's the size. If you move to U, so that's this number. Now we need to understand who moved from E to N. Okay. So the largest cohort in this number is retirement, right? And then, so you also have someone who decide to go back to school, a small fraction. Okay, so those are the main individuals who move between E and N. Now, you have people move from E to U, employee to unemployed. So usually those are layoff, right? But we also need to consider there are people who voluntarily search for better job, relocate. All right. So this is from E to N or U. So now, similarly, we can look at people who are in here, in island N. It could move to employed. So let's use different color. Okay, so highlight the difference. So this give me this group or this group. Right, so now we are in N, so you can move to E, or you can move to U. Right? So now, if you are in here, not in labor force, you move to employee. So usually this is college graduates, right? So you are not in labor force, and now you graduate and you start to looking for a job. If you got a job immediately, and then so you are lucky, you are employed. But there are students who didn't get a job immediately, so they are unemployed. But also there are people who has been laid off during the recession and get desperate and so desperate and decide to quit. But now the economy is recovering, and then they want to return to labor force again. And then the first stop, so this must be unemployed, right? So this is not in labor force to unemployed or in employee. So finally, we look at last part. Let's use another color. So let's see, let's pick this. So you are in unemployed, but you could move to here, or you can move to here, right? So that refers to this number or this number. Unemployed to employed, essentially you either you record right? Because you were like earlier, you were furloughed or you were laid off or you just found a job. For unemployed goes to not in labor force, there's someone who decide to return to labor force. Sorry, so unemployed people not in labor force, this means those people are so discouraged, right? So they don't want to search anymore. Right? So those are the dynamics of the labor market. But from this discussion, you can see there are different types of unemployment. Now we go to our former discussion. Okay. Frictional. So what is frictional unemployment? So this is unemployment due to time or effort the worker spent in job search. Just think about the college grads, right? So it takes time for them to find out the right job, the right location to work. Okay? And usually it's called a temporary unemployment. But generically, so this is caused by scarcity of information. And this scarcity leads people to take time to find out what they like, what they are good at. Like this background picture shows. Right? So there are 3 individuals. So each of them has different personality, different advantage, different passion. And then, so usually take them for some time to find out what they are passionate about, what they are good at, and then get the training, and then to find the right job. Okay, so this scarcity of information about yourself, about the potential job, leads to temporary unemployment, right? So usually we can look at the spell of unemployment or the length of the unemployment to identify who are frictional unemployed, right? So usually, so the frictional unemployment has a length of unemployment short, okay? Like here, so less than 5 weeks, usually this is caused by frictional. Right? So those like chronic, so that's usually caused by other reason. So why a frictional unemployment has a shorter spell or shorter time period? It's because they can find a job, right? So there's job available. It just takes time to sort out things, right? So this is frictional. Now we move to the second type, structural. What is structural unemployment? So usually it's caused by some structural problem in our economy, right? And so that there are more people looking for jobs than there are jobs available, right? So this happens even the economy is at the peak of the business cycle. We are not talking about like in a recession, and then so you have more people is looking for a job in particular sector. So we are looking at the peak of the business cycle. Okay? And in the particular part of the economy, so we still have more job seekers than the available job. So usual cause, first, labor union. Now let's see what is labor union. Union is an association of workers. So this association usually bargain collectively with employers over wage, benefit, and a working condition. Okay? Like the teachers union, right? Or like, so one of the biggest union in the United States is the auto worker, like in Michigan. Right? So they bargain for higher wage. And now if they bargain for higher wage, so what happened? So they're going to artificially usually creates unemployment. Why? So look at this labor market, supply and the demand. So without the union or without the intervention of union, and then we have equilibrium wage. So that's going to give you the equilibrium labor supply or labor demand. If you look at this point, market clears 0% of unemployment. But the union is bargaining for higher wage. So now at this wage, you can see the supply exceed demand. We have a surplus. So this is surplus. So there's a surplus of worker. But also this means there's a shortage of a job, meaning there's unemployment. Right? So this is caused by this structure instead of the business cycle. All right. Now we go back. Besides union, we have efficiency wage. What is the efficiency wage? So efficiency wage is the wage that employer they set, and this wage is above the equilibrium wage. Okay. And so because it is above the equilibrium wage, so that's naturally is going to cause unemployment. But you may wonder, so why they want to set a wage higher than the employment wage? This is because so they want to give the worker incentive to work hard. How that help? It's because without this efficiency wage, the worker knew so can always find a job in other business or other firm. If that's the case, I don't care, right? So why would I put effort? Because I always find a job if I lose my job today. So the employer respond that by offering a higher wage, and then so that's going to create unemployment. So this unemployment works as a stick. So in that sense, this efficiency wage is a carrot and a stick. So this carrot give you incentive. So the stick works as a punishment via the existence of unemployment. Right? All right, so there are other possible causes, including side effect of government policy, okay, and the mismatch between employees and employers. So those structure unemployment. So for this part, I want to show you the cost and the benefit of a minimum wage, right? Because again, so this union usually just offer a higher wage, we call it minimum wage. This minimum wage so far, we just says that's going to cause, is going to lead to structural unemployment, right? But in general, so this minimum wage has its cost, also has its benefit. The benefit is we're going to raise the standard of living for people who live in that wage, okay? So now I'm going to show you these practice, and then so we're going to watch the short video. Right. So Jasmine recently moved to Florida because she loves warm climate. Being new to the area, she will need to spend a few weeks looking for new jobs. This is an example of, so this is an example of frictional, right? Just take time for her to find a job, right? Okay.